It started on a quiet Sunday morning, the kind of morning that smells like coffee, forgiveness, and second chances. But not for him. Mark had everything a man could ask for: a steady job, a beautiful wife, a home built on years of comfort. Yet, beneath that polished surface lived something ugly: pride. Pride that made him look down on the one man who had given him everything without ever asking for anything back: his wife's father. The old man was kind, simple, and poor by comparison, the kind of man who fixed things with his hands and prayed with his heart. But to Mark, he was just a burden, and that mistake was about to teach him a lesson he would never forget. The trouble began when his father-in-law, Harold, moved in with them after an injury. He walked slowly, talked softly, and never complained, not even when Mark made it clear he wasn't welcome. The small acts of disrespect grew sharper each day: the eye rolls, the sighs, the cruel jokes made behind the old man's back. His wife, Laura, begged him to show compassion, but Mark brushed her off. "He's not my problem," he said once, loud enough for Harold to hear. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that hurts more than shouting ever could. One afternoon, Harold quietly left the house. He said he was taking a walk, but hours passed, and he didn't return. Panic set in. Laura called everyone she could think of, tears streaming down her face. Mark drove through the streets, his stomach twisted with guilt, realizing that the man he had treated as a nuisance might actually be gone for good. The sun was setting when he spotted something that made his heart stop. A group of bikers gathered near the edge of town, and in the middle of them sat Harold, his frail frame surrounded by leather and steel. Mark pulled over, ready to demand answers, but what he saw next made his anger vanish. One of the bikers knelt beside Harold, adjusting the bandage on his injured leg. Another handed him water, while a third sat quietly, listening to the old man talk, not out of pity, but respect. These rough, tattooed men, the ones society often labeled as trouble, were treating Harold like royalty. And that's when it hit Mark. These strangers were showing more humanity to his father-in-law than he ever had. As Mark approached, the leader of the group stood up, a massive man with calm eyes that saw right through him. "You his son?" he asked. Mark hesitated. "His son-in-law," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. The biker nodded slowly, then said something that would echo in Mark's mind for the rest of his life. "Then you better start acting like it. Respect ain't about blood. It's about heart." In that moment, surrounded by engines, wind, and truth, Mark's pride began to crumble, and what replaced it was something far greater: the beginning of redemption. Mark stood frozen, his breath catching as the engines rumbled around him like distant thunder. The bikers weren't what he expected. No arrogance, no menace, just quiet authority. The leader, a man called Jax, had a weathered face and the calm, steady presence of someone who had seen more of life's storms than most could handle. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "We found him walking alone," Jax said, nodding toward Harold. "Didn't look like anyone was looking after him." The words stung harder than any punch. Mark opened his mouth to explain, but the truth sat heavy on his chest. How could he explain neglect when the evidence of it was standing right there in front of him? Harold looked up then, tired eyes behind a gentle smile. "I told him I was fine," he said softly. "Just wanted some air." But Jax shook his head. "Man like you shouldn't be walking these roads alone." There was something in his tone, a quiet respect, that made Mark's throat tighten. The bikers didn't treat Harold like a burden or a charity case. They treated him like a man who had earned his place in the world, someone worthy of dignity. It was the kind of respect Mark hadn't shown once since the day Harold had moved in. As the group talked, Harold began sharing stories from his past, tales of hard work, lost friends, and the simple joy of fixing engines by hand. The bikers listened intently, nodding, even laughing at moments, like they were sitting with an elder from their own brotherhood. Mark watched in silence, realizing how much of the man's soul he had ignored. Every word Harold spoke painted a picture of humility and wisdom, lessons Mark had never cared to learn. He'd been too focused on status, on appearances, on the illusion that success gave him worth. But in that moment, standing beside those rough men and his fragile father-in-law, Mark saw that worth wasn't something you showed off. It was something you lived. When Harold finished his story, one of the younger bikers said, "You remind me of my old man." He used to say respect is like a mirror. You get it back only when you give it. The sentence hit Mark harder than he wanted to admit. He looked at Harold, who still smiled like nothing was wrong, like his son-in-law hadn't spent weeks making him feel invisible. The guilt was unbearable. "Come on," Jax finally said, breaking the silence. "We'll get him home." Mark nodded, unable to speak. The ride back wasn't long, but to him, it felt like the longest journey of his life. As the motorcycles escorted them through the fading light, Mark followed behind, each engine's roar echoing the words that wouldn't leave his head. Respect is like a mirror. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about himself, his pride, or his success. He was thinking about the man he'd hurt, and the men who had just shown him how real strength looks. By the time they reached the house, something inside him had already begun to change, though he didn't yet understand how deep that transformation would go. When they arrived, the bikers helped Harold to the porch. Laura rushed outside, tears of relief spilling down her cheeks as she embraced her father. "I was so scared," she whispered, her voice trembling. Harold patted her hand. "I'm fine, sweetheart. These gentlemen took care of me." Mark stood a few steps away, silent, watching the scene unfold like a stranger looking through glass. He wanted to step forward, to apologize, to fix everything, but shame kept him still. Jax glanced at him once, then back at Harold. "You got a good daughter," he said. "Don't forget that, son." Then, with a respectful nod, he and his brothers turned to leave. But Harold stopped them. "Wait," he said. "Would you come in for coffee? It's the least we can do." The bikers hesitated, then looked to Jax, who shrugged. "If it's no trouble, sir." And so, for the first time, Mark found himself sitting at his own kitchen table with men he never thought he'd associate with. The smell of coffee filled the air as Laura poured cups for everyone. The conversation flowed easily, laughter, stories, and small jokes, but beneath it all was a quiet tension, one that settled squarely on Mark's shoulders. He felt like a man sitting in his own trial, each act of kindness from these strangers serving as another reminder of his failures. At one point, Harold mentioned how much he admired the bikers' unity. "You look out for each other," he said. "That's something the world could use more of." Jax nodded. "It's not just about looking out for each other," he said. "It's about respect. Doesn't matter who you are, what you ride, or what you've got. A man's value is measured by how he treats those who can't give him anything back." The room fell quiet. Mark felt the words dig deep. His wife glanced at him, her expression unreadable, but her eyes said enough. She had been waiting for him to understand that truth all along. When the bikers finally stood to leave, Harold shook each of their hands. "Thank you," he said, "for the ride, and for reminding me that good men still exist." Jax smiled. "You don't owe us anything, old-timer. You taught us something today, too." Harold laughed softly. "Oh, what's that?" Jax's eyes flicked briefly to Mark. "That respect isn't taught, it's caught. Some lessons just take a while to sink in." After they left, the house fell into silence. Mark sat alone at the table, staring at his coffee. The reflection in the dark liquid showed a man he barely recognized, proud, cold, and small. He thought about everything Jax had said, everything Harold had endured, and for the first time, the walls he'd built around himself began to crack. It wasn't anger or guilt that filled him now. It was something far heavier. Regret. That night, the house felt heavier than ever. Harold had gone to bed early, exhausted, and Laura sat silently on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Mark wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He had built his pride so high that he didn't know how to climb down from it. The air between them felt cold, not from anger, but from disappointment. She didn't have to say anything. Her silence said it all. "I didn't mean for her to go this far," Mark finally muttered. Laura looked up, her eyes red from crying. "You didn't mean for him to get hurt? Or you didn't mean for someone else to notice?" The question cut deep. He had no answer. When she finally went to bed, Mark stayed behind, sitting in the dark. Every sound, the ticking clock, the creak of the floorboards, reminded him of Harold's soft voice, of Jax's calm words. Respect isn't taught, it's caught. He kept replaying it in his mind like a loop he couldn't escape. At some point, he stood and walked into the small guest room where Harold slept. The old man's breathing was slow, steady. On the nightstand beside him lay a photograph, a younger Harold, holding a little girl with pigtails. Laura. In the photo, Harold looked proud, strong, and alive. Seeing it broke something in Mark. He realized then that he had taken everything this man represented for granted. Not just his presence, but his quiet love, his patience, his loyalty. Harold hadn't asked for much. Just kindness. Just a place to belong. Yet Mark, blinded by pride, had turned that kindness into a target. The shame washed over him like cold rain, leaving him hollow. For the first time in years, he knelt beside the bed, whispering a quiet apology that Harold would never hear. "I'm sorry," he said. "I treated you like you were in the way, when you're the only one who understood what family really means." In the morning, Harold woke early, as he always did. Mark was already in the kitchen, making coffee. The old man smiled faintly, surprised. "Didn't expect to see you up before the sun," he said. Mark forced a small smile. "Figured it was time I learned a thing or two from you." Harold chuckled softly, but didn't press. There was something different about Mark's tone, something honest, almost fragile. They drank their coffee in silence, and for once, the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind that hinted at something beginning to heal. Later that day, Mark drove into town alone. The rumble of motorcycles caught his attention. The same bikers, parked outside a diner. He hesitated before walking in. The moment Jack saw him, he nodded once, as if he'd been expecting him. "Thought you might show up," Jack said. "Coffee?" Mark nodded, taking a seat. The men didn't judge, didn't mock. They just waited. And when Mark finally spoke, his voice cracked with a kind of humility he'd never known before. "You were right," he said. "I didn't respect what I had until I almost lost it." Jax leaned back, studying him for a moment before replying. "Then don't waste it, son. Real men don't fix their mistakes with words. They fix them with actions." The following week, Mark began doing something he had never done before, spending time with Harold. Not out of guilt, but out of genuine effort. He started small, helping him fix the fence in the backyard, sitting beside him during old Western shows, asking questions about the past. At first, Harold was cautious, unsure if this was just another fleeting gesture. But Mark didn't quit. Each day, he showed up, humble, quiet, consistent. And slowly, the wall between them began to crumble. One afternoon, while repairing a loose step on the porch, Harold spoke up. "You remind me of myself when I was younger," he said. Mark looked over, surprised. "Me? How?" Harold smiled faintly. "Stubborn. Thought I had all the answers. Took me a long time to realize pride's just a fancy word for fear." Mark paused his work, the hammer in his hand frozen midair. "Fear of what?" he asked. Harold looked out at the horizon. "Fear of being wrong. Fear of needing someone. Fear of not being enough." The words hit deep, deeper than Mark expected. For a long time, he just stared at the old man, finally seeing not weakness, but strength in his gentleness. As days turned into weeks, the house began to feel different. There was laughter again, small, genuine bursts of it. Laura watched the change unfold with cautious hope. She saw her husband carrying groceries for her father, fixing things without being asked, even joining Harold on morning walks. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, real, and healing. And though Mark never spoke of the bikers again, their lesson lingered in every action he took. He understood now what they had tried to teach him. That respect is not a gesture. It's a lifestyle. One evening, while sitting on the porch, the distant rumble of motorcycles filled the air again. Mark looked up and smiled faintly. Harold noticed. "Friends of yours?" he asked. Mark chuckled softly. "Something like that." The bikes slowed as they passed the house, their riders nodding once in silent acknowledgement before continuing down the road. Mark didn't wave. He didn't need to. That single nod was enough, a sign between men who understood each other without words. Later that night, as Mark tucked Harold in, the old man said quietly, "I'm proud of you." Mark froze. "For what?" Harold smiled, eyes half closed. "For learning what really matters before it was too late." The words lingered long after the lights went out. Mark stood by the door for a while, staring into the dim glow of the hallway, realizing that for the first time in his life, he didn't need to prove his worth. He just needed to live it. Weeks turned into months, and the bond between Mark and Harold grew stronger than anyone could have imagined. What began as guilt had evolved into genuine affection. Every morning, they worked side by side, fixing the porch, tending the garden, sharing quiet conversations that felt like long overdue confessions. Harold's frail hands moved slower now, but his wisdom flowed with the same steady rhythm. Mark often found himself listening more than speaking, realizing how much he'd missed by never truly hearing the man before. The old wounds between them didn't vanish overnight, but they began to fade under the warmth of respect. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Harold showed Mark an old photograph, a group of bikers standing proudly beside their motorcycles. "That was me, back in the day," Harold said with a grin. Mark blinked in disbelief. "You rode?" Harold laughed softly. "Son, I lived on that bike. Rode with a group called the Iron Brotherhood. We weren't troublemakers. We were brothers. Men who kept each other standing when the world tried to knock us down." Mark stared at the image, the same leather vests, the same patches he'd seen on the men who had helped Harold that night. "Wait, Jackson and his crew." Harold's eyes glimmered with pride. "They're the sons of my old brothers." The realization hit Mark like a revelation. The bikers hadn't just stumbled across Harold by chance. They had found him because of who he once was. They had shown him the same respect their fathers once gave him. It wasn't an act of pity, it was legacy. The circle had come full, carried by the same spirit that bound men across time through loyalty and honor. For the first time, Mark understood that the lesson wasn't just about how to treat one man. It was about understanding what kind of man he wanted to become. That night, Mark sat alone on the porch, the old photo resting on his knee. He thought about everything Harold had endured, the mistakes he himself had made, and the strangers who had taught him what family truly meant. He realized that the world often confuses toughness with cruelty, but the strongest men he'd ever met were the ones who carried kindness without needing to prove it. Real strength, he now knew, wasn't loud. It was humble, patient, and consistent. The kind of strength that held others up rather than pushing them down. The next morning, Mark surprised Harold with something special, an old motorcycle, restored piece by piece. "It's not much," he said, "but I figured a man like you should have his wheels back." Harold's eyes filled with tears as he ran his hand over the polished chrome. "You didn't have to." "I did," Mark interrupted gently. "You taught me the respect isn't words, it's what you do." Harold started the engine, and as it roared to life, both men laughed, a sound of redemption echoing through the quiet morning air. Not long after, Jax and his crew rode back into town. They hadn't planned to stop, but when they saw Harold and Mark outside the house, they couldn't resist pulling over. The sight that greeted them made Jack smile. Harold astride his restored motorcycle, Mark standing proudly beside him. "Well, I'll be damned," Jack said with a grin. "Didn't think I'd see the day." Harold chuckled, tipping his head. "Told you this old man still had a few miles left." The bikers laughed, surrounding him like family. Mark stepped forward, shaking Jax's hand firmly. "You were right," he said. "Respect isn't about what you say, it's what you show." Jax studied him for a moment before nodding. "Looks like you caught the lesson after all." Then he turned to Harold. "He's one of us now, huh?" Harold smirked. "He's learning." The group laughed, and for a moment, there was no division, no lines between the suits and the leather, the proud and the humble. Just men connected by the same unspoken code: loyalty, respect, and heart. Before they left, Jax looked at Mark and said, "If you ever need a ride, you know where to find us." Mark nodded. "I think I already found what I needed." Jax smiled knowingly, then started his engine. The roar of 50 motorcycles filled the air, rolling like thunder down the open road. As the sound faded, Harold turned to Mark. "Funny thing about life," he said. "You think you're teaching someone else, and it turns out you're the one learning." Mark smiled. "Guess we both had lessons to catch." The months that followed were peaceful, but never dull. Mark and Harold spent their days in quiet companionship. Rides through the countryside, dinners with Laura, evenings spent watching the stars from the porch. Sometimes they'd spot headlights in the distance, the bikers passing through town, and both men would nod in silent acknowledgement, bound forever by the moment that changed everything. One crisp autumn morning, Mark found Harold sitting by the bike, lost in thought. "You thinking about your brothers?" Mark asked. Harold smiled faintly. "Always." He paused, then added softly, "But I've got a new one now. Mark swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. You sure do. They didn't need to say more. In that quiet exchange, the past had found peace, the present had found purpose, and the future, for both men, finally felt right. Winter came quietly that year, covering the town in a thin blanket of frost. The bikes were parked, the long rides paused, and life slowed to a calm rhythm. Harold spent most of his days by the window, watching the world move at its steady pace. Mark would join him every morning, 2 cups of coffee between them, their silence as comfortable as conversation. They didn't need to talk much anymore. Understanding had replaced words. Sometimes Harold would tell a story from his writing days, his voice filled with nostalgia and pride. Mark would listen, not out of obligation, but because he cherished every sentence, knowing each story was a piece of a life lived fully and fearlessly. One afternoon, as snow began to fall, Harold asked Mark to take him for one last ride. It's been too long since I felt the wind, he said with a faint smile. Mark hesitated. You sure, old man? Roads are slick. Harold chuckled. Son, I've ridden through worse. Trust me. They bundled up, rolled the motorcycle out of the garage, and hit the open road. The wind was sharp, but Harold's laughter carried through it, a sound that echoed with freedom. Cars honked as they passed. People waved. 2 riders cutting through winter, one teaching, the other learning what it meant to truly live in the moment. They stopped by a small overlook where the snow met the horizon. Harold dismounted slowly, breathing deeply, his eyes glistening. You feel that, he said. That's life. Real life. Doesn't matter how cold it gets. As long as you've got someone beside you, it's worth a ride. Mark stood beside him, silent, knowing this wasn't just another one of Harold's speeches. It was something deeper, a farewell wrapped in wisdom. You've come a long way, kid, Harold said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Don't stop now. A few days later, Harold's health began to fade. The doctor said it was time. His heart was simply tired. Laura wept quietly, and Mark stayed by Harold's bedside, holding his hand through the long nights. You gave me back more than I ever lost, Harold whispered one evening, his voice weak but sure. You made me proud. Not because you changed, but because you chose to. Mark swallowed hard, fighting back tears. You taught me what real respect means, he said. Harold smiled faintly. Then I did my job. And with that, he closed his eyes, the faintest trace of a smile still on his lips. The days that followed were heavy. The house felt emptier, quieter, but not cold. Because in every corner, Harold's presence lingered, in the tools by the shed, the coffee mugs by the sink, the photographs on the wall. Mark didn't fill the silence with noise. Instead, he kept living the lesson Harold had given him, with humility, patience, and heart. The world had lost a good man, but Mark knew he hadn't truly gone. He'd just taken the long road ahead, the one every rider eventually finds. Spring returned, bringing color and warmth back to the town. Mark spent his days repairing Harold's old motorcycle, not because it needed fixing, but because it kept him close. Every bolt he tightened, every piece he polished felt like a conversation. Laura often watched from the porch, her heart breaking and healing at the same time. The man she saw now was nothing like the one she had once begged to show compassion. He had become the kind of man her father would have been proud to ride beside. One morning, a familiar sound rumbled down the street, the roar of engines. Mark stepped outside to see Jax and his crew rolling up to the house. They parked silently, removing their helmets, faces solemn but warm. We heard, Jax said softly. The old man was one of the best. Mark nodded, his throat tightening. Yeah, he whispered. He was. The bikers gathered in a loose circle, their leather jackets glinting under the sunlight. We're doing a memorial ride, Jax said, and we don't roll without family. You coming? Mark didn't hesitate. Yeah, I'm coming. He walked into the garage, pulled on Harold's old riding jacket, and climbed onto his bike. The air was thick with emotion as engines roared to life. A sound that had once intimidated him now felt like belonging. As they rode through town, people came out of shops and houses, waving, wiping tears. They knew what the ride meant. Not loss, but respect. At the edge of town, they stopped at the same overlook where Harold had taken his final ride. The wind blew strong, carrying the scent of wild grass and asphalt. Jax turned to Mark. You got the honors. Mark nodded, pulling a small pouch from his jacket. Harold's ashes. He opened it slowly, letting the wind take them. The air shimmered as the gray dust caught the sunlight, scattering into the sky. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Jack said quietly, "He's riding free now." Mark smiled through his tears. He always was. The bikers revved their engines one last time, a thunderous salute that echoed across the hills. And as they rode back into town, Mark felt something lift from his chest. Not grief, but gratitude. The kind of peace that comes when you finally understand that love, respect, and brotherhood don't end when a person's gone. They live on, mile after mile, in the hearts of those who choose to carry them forward. In the weeks after the memorial ride, life seemed to move in slow motion, quiet, reflective, and meaningful. Mark often found himself revisiting the places where he and Harold had shared their simplest moments. The porch swing, the fence they'd fixed together, the worn-out diner booth where Harold once shared stories of the open road. Everywhere he went, he could still feel Harold's presence, not as an ache, but as a reminder. Every lesson, every word of advice, every patient smile had left its mark. The man who once avoided humility now found comfort in it. He finally understood that respect wasn't a gesture reserved for the worthy. It was the foundation of every human connection that mattered. One afternoon, as Mark was leaving the hardware store, he noticed an older man struggling to load lumber into the back of his truck. Without thinking, he walked over to help. The man thanked him, surprised. "You don't see much of that anymore," he said. Mark smiled faintly. "I didn't used to, either," he replied. "But someone taught me better." As he drove home, he realized how deeply Harold's influence had rooted itself in him. It wasn't about grand gestures or redemption arcs anymore. It was about the quiet, consistent decision to live with heart, to treat people with the dignity he once withheld. Soon after, Jax came by the house, carrying a worn envelope. Inside was a patch, black leather, stitched with silver letters that read, "Iron Brotherhood, Legacy Rider." Mark stared at it, stunned. "Harold wanted you to have it," Jax said. "Said you earned it the hard way." Mark didn't know what to say. He ran his fingers over the patch, feeling the weight of its meaning. "He really thought of me that way." Jack smiled. "He didn't think of you like a son-in-law, man. He thought of you like a brother." The words hit deep, and for the first time, Mark didn't hold back his tears. That evening, he framed the patch and hung it on the wall beside Harold's photograph. The one with him and his bike, wind in his hair, eyes full of life. Underneath, Mark placed a single sentence engraved on a small plaque. "Respect is not given. It's earned through how you live." It wasn't just decoration. It was a promise, a code to live by. And every time he walked past it, he touched the frame, almost as if to say, "I'm still learning, old man." Months passed, and the sound of motorcycles once again became part of the town's rhythm. People didn't cross the street when they heard them anymore. They waved. They smiled, because they remembered the man who had changed what those engines meant, from noise and rebellion to loyalty and honor. And though Harold was gone, his legacy had reshaped more than just one man. It had transformed a community that learned, through his example, that respect isn't earned by power, it's born in humility. Years later, Mark had gray in his beard and lines on his face, but his eyes still carried the same warmth Harold had once shown him. The town had changed, new families, new roads, but the spirit of those days still lingered like echoes of thunder in the distance. Every year, on the anniversary of Harold's passing, the Iron Brotherhood gathered at that same overlook. Dozens of bikes lined up side by side, facing the horizon, their engines silent in reverence. It had become tradition, not a funeral, not a memorial, but a celebration of the man who had taught them that respect, once shared, never dies. Mark always arrived early, bringing 2 cups of coffee, one for himself, one for Harold. He'd sit on the same rock where they once stood and talk softly into the wind. "You were right about everything," he'd say with a smile. "Turns out, the road teaches you a lot when you're finally ready to listen." Then he'd pour a bit of the coffee onto the ground, a quiet toast to the man who had shown him that redemption doesn't come from forgiveness alone. It comes from how you live after the apology. When the others arrived, Jax would always call out, "You ready, brother?" And Mark would nod, sliding on his helmet, starting the engine. The air would fill with the sound of rumbling unity, a reminder that some bonds never fade. They just evolve. Together, they'd ride the long highway, sunlight catching on chrome, the wind carrying the memory of Harold's laughter somewhere between earth and sky. At the end of each ride, when the engines quieted and the helmets came off, Mark would always share a few words. He used to say, he'd begin, that a man's worth isn't in how loud he talks, but in how many lives he makes better by staying true. So if you remember anything from his story, let it be that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you build every day with your choices. And every time, without fail, the crowd would nod, silent, touched by the simplicity of truth. As dusk fell and the group dispersed, Mark would remain for a while, watching the last light fade over the open road. He'd smile softly, whispering, "You still ride with us, old man." The wind would answer with a faint rush, a familiar, comforting sound. Because Harold's journey hadn't ended the day he left. It continued through every rider he had inspired, every man he had changed, and every heart that learned. Through him, that respect is the road that never ends. In the end, the story of Mark and Harold wasn't about pride or even redemption. It was about the quiet, timeless power of respect. The kind that doesn't shout or demand, but transforms everything it touches. Mark began as a man who mistook pride for strength, who believed respect was something owed to him. But life, in its unrelenting honesty, brought him face to face with men who had nothing to prove and an old soul who had everything to teach. And through loss, love, and the road that never truly ends, he discovered what real strength looks like, not in dominance, but in humility. The echo of engines that once symbolized fear and rebellion now carried a different message, one of unity, loyalty, and brotherhood. Those sounds no longer haunted Mark. They guided him. Each rumble of the motorcycle became a heartbeat of memory, reminding him that the lessons of a good man don't fade when he's gone. They live on in the choices we make. Harold's legacy didn't just change Mark. It changed everyone who crossed his path. Because true respect, once given, ripples outward like waves. Endless, powerful, and quietly unstoppable. And maybe that's what life is really about. Learning how to see the value in others before it's too late. To treat the people around us, especially those we overlook, with the same dignity we crave for ourselves. The men on those motorcycles didn't just ride to show force. They rode to remind the world that compassion and courage can live in the same heart. That no matter how rough the exterior, real respect isn't earned through fear. It's built through kindness. That is the kind of legacy that outlives us all. As the sun set behind the horizon, Mark stood by the road, watching the last of the bikers disappear into the distance. He didn't feel grief anymore, only gratitude. Gratitude for the man who showed him what it means to love without expectation, and for the brothers who taught him that respect isn't inherited, it's lived. Life would keep moving, the engines would keep roaring, and somewhere, Harold's laughter would ride on the wind, whispering the truth he had always known, that no man stands taller than when he bows his heart to what is right. And if this story touched you, if it reminded you that respect, compassion, and second chances still matter, then carry that message forward. Share your thoughts below, because your voice might be the one that inspires someone else to change. Leave your like if you believe that kindness is strength, and subscribe to join a community where stories like this remind us that no one is too far gone to learn again. Because in the end, we all ride the same road, and the way we treat each other along the journey is what truly defines who we are.